Welcome back to another unhinged research with Schirr-Genius, aka Is Edgar Degas Jacques the Ripper, part 27. Part 26, I had told you that I had found Parisian murders, and I have evidence of those for you here today. Basically, we'll be going over these 13 murders, but I also thought it was important to make two quick corrections. Number one, I thought there were 3 torsos in the torso murder in Paris in 1886. It turns out there was 1 torso left in 3 different packages across the city. That is the problem with using Google Translate to try to read 19th century Parisian newspapers. It's also the reason that my French pronunciation is improving steadily, but still sloppy. Obviously, if I'm going to continue this research, it would behoove me to learn the language. So the man who coined the term demimonde, when speaking of the world of courtesans in France, a phrase that means half-world, was not, as I said, Alexandre Dumas, the author of The Three Musketeers. It was Alexandre Dumas, his illegitimate son, who wrote La Dame aux Camélias. And even if you're not familiar with that book by Fee, you might know the Italian opera La Traviata. But I digress. Let's get back to the unsolved murders of Parisian sex workers. Some of this is from French newspapers of the time. Some of this is from like a recounting of lurid tales of bordellos from France that had this gruesome dedication page to all of these who were... So murder number 4, named Renaud in the book, is dated as 1883. I have not been able to verify that date yet. And it seems a little sus because, of course, Marie Renaud, I talked about last time, that was a very famous case that Pranzini was actually executed for committing. So the first 3 that are in black, I wouldn't consider those murders that I have enough detail as of yet to attribute to anyone. I also need to do a ton more research on the torso murder here in Paris and also the ones that were in London. Even for the most basic research, that looks pretty related, and I'm going to have to go dig my teeth into that. It's not going to be pleasant. I'm not really looking forward to it. All research I've done thus far has been gruesome. The 1866 murder of Marie Aguital was blamed on a man named Prado, who was also executed, but she was a dancer at the Eden Theater, and a lot of the details of her murder are reminiscent of the Jacques the Ripper killings, most specifically of the 5th of Mary Kelly. So I am going into a deep dive on that one. You'll hear more about that in coming days. The ones that I really want to talk to you about today are the ones in purple. The murders of Marie Fellerath and Helene Stein were never solved. In both cases, the victim was a sex worker. In both cases, she was near her home. And just as a quick aside, this is a map of all of the residences that Degas maintained in Paris across his life. His are the ones that are in the 30s. You can see they're all sort of in this general area. This is a map that the author of The Courtesan and the Gigolo provided in order to give you a sense of where everything happened in these murders. In particular, the murder of Marie Renaud, but also it's a good overview of the world of the demi-monde at the time. You have the Champs-Élysées, the Palais Royal, and a lot of the operas up there. And in case you can't tell, these maps overlap. The yellow marking is mine and denotes where Degas lived. Marie Renaud lived on the Rue Montaigne, which is actually like a very quiet street in comparison to all of the things that were happening over here in the demi-monde. So you can see this is actually an hour walk. All of this is much closer. Now, Helene was simultaneously strangled and stabbed with a stylet, which is a very thin blade. But other than that, the actual details are somewhat vague. It does refer to her as mutilated several times, but doesn't discuss how. There are more details about Marie Fellerath's death, but the most interesting one, of course, is that she was killed with a Japanese knife. Now, prior to the Convention of Kanagawa, which was in 1854, trade with Japan was on a very limited basis and only with the Dutch. Degas does come from the Dutch. It means of chaos, interestingly enough. If you're an art historian, you probably already know that the Kanagawa Treaty led into a flood of ukiyo-e prints entering Europe and influencing art left and right. You might remember that Vincent van Gogh was very fond of Japanese ukiyo-e prints. Here he has Mount Fuji in the background of one of his paintings. But of course the date on this painting is 1887. Especially in the 19th century, artists were usually on the cutting edge of technology and of international adoption of art and trends. Van Gogh was not very well connected and not very well liked, and he did not learn of this until Toulouse-Lautrec sort of introduced him to it in 1885. However, in 1879, that was on the early side, even for artists to be very influenced by Japanese art. But guess who was super into it in 1879? Why, that would be Degas. In fact, 1879 is the year that he introduced 5 different fan-shaped paintings to the Impressionist exhibition. In his entire lifetime, we only know of 25 of these, and most of them were either from this year or around that time. And the fan shape is even more coincidental because I mentioned that there was a new style of reporting called the fait divers, and that this was the advent of the true crime girly, because suddenly these serialized newspapers were serializing the investigation of crime. And each day you could tune into new and exciting clues. The most interesting thing about Marie Fellerath's death is that the knife was not found initially with the body. In The Courtesan and the Gigolo, Aaron Freundschuh tells an interesting story of Schirr-Genius, an intrepid young reporter who decides to make his career in the fait divers. When Marie Fellerath was murdered and they released the primary suspect after he had a perfect alibi, Grisson did not rest. Instead, he finagled or bribed his way into the evidence room. Because although the murder weapon had been found already, a plain wooden-handled knife that looked vaguely Japanese in design, he thought there must be more to the story, and sure enough there was. He found in the evidence box the sheath to the knife, which had been collected and tagged with a location but never reported on, and interestingly enough, it was in the shape of a fan, and it was ornate and beautiful. And it did confirm that the knife was something strange and unusual. So Marie Fellerath was killed on the 23rd of February in 1879, but her murder continued to be brought up for years because it was never solved. Any time that a sex worker or a courtesan was murdered, they would bring up Marie, they would bring up Helene. When Marie Renaud and her innocent housekeeper and her innocent housekeeper's child daughter were all murdered in their beds asleep, throats slit. Again, Marie Fellerath and Helene Stein were brought up as incompetency on the local police's part. You can see I am not the first to notice the similarities between the murders in Paris and the murders in London. Contemporary newspapers were quick to point out the similarities. So what do you think? Is it possible that there were some Parisian murders that predate the London Jacques the Ripper killings? Is it possible that a 45-year-old artist could have been going on a killing spree? Let me know what you think.